Welcome to New Haven, Kentucky, a small town located in the heart of the Bluegrass State, just next door to the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln.
Hey, y'all grab a tire. Got a tire ready?
There's definitely no shortage of Southern hospitality in this small town. Originally called Pottenger's Landing, the town is presently home to a population of just under 1,000 people. When the railroad finally arrived in 1856, the town grew and prospered, having a much faster and more reliable way to transport goods and people to Louisville. Today, New Haven is still known as being a railroad town, home to the Kentucky Railway Museum and an iconic steam locomotive, Louisville and Nashville, number 152.
I've been with the museum now almost 20 years, and I started down here in 1996. And the mission of the Kentucky Railway Museum is to preserve and tell the story of Kentucky's railroads and the people who built them. I can't think of one single artifact that tells the story better than 152. It served the needs of the people of Kentucky. It ran a local service between Louisville and Nashville. This is a chance for an engine to continue on where it used to run in regular service. So I can't think of any better way to interpret that than to have it in this natural setting.
The principal passenger locomotive for the L&N Railroad in the 1900s, turn of the century, was their 10-wheeler. As trains got heavier, they decided that they needed something better, so the Pacific, being the new wheel arrangement coming into vogue then, was selected, and they asked the Rogers Locomotive Works in Paterson, New Jersey, to build them 5 prototypes of this particular wheel arrangement, and they did in 1905 and sent them to the L&N Railroad, which they used for a number of years, were so well satisfied with it that they decided to build 50 or 60 others and bought the building rights and built the rest of the locomotives in their South Louisville shop.
Designed to pull the L&N Railroad's most important scheduled passenger trains, number 152 was the epitome of high-speed steam. However, in 1912, 152 would pull one of the most important passenger trains in U.S. history. Former President Theodore Roosevelt's whistle-stop tour between Louisville and Corbin, Kentucky.
In 1908, Teddy Roosevelt had completed his second term as president, and he had pledged in 1904 when he was reelected that he would not run for another election. Instead, in 1908, he turned the presidency over to William Howard Taft, who was his hand-picked successor. Teddy went off to Africa to go big game hunting for the next year, and then did a big tour of Europe with his wife. By the time he came back, he was very, very unhappy with what William Howard Taft was doing as president. He felt that Taft had betrayed his progressivism, his progressive principles, and the programs for which Teddy had been fighting. So in 1912, Teddy decided to run for the Republican nomination and deprive his friend Taft of that nomination. Probably the real truth of it is that the only person Teddy could imagine to be a good president was himself. Most presidential campaigns up until this time period, the president did not actively campaign. The candidate for president would stay home. Supporters might come and make visits to his home where he would give speeches, but he would have surrogates who traveled the country campaigning for him. Teddy was one of the first to break that mold, and as a presidential candidate to actively campaign. So this is part of Teddy's pattern anyway, to be out meeting the public, traveling from place to place, making speeches, attracting attention. Teddy is one of the first presidential candidates to really campaign in person. And in the ensuing campaign, there were really 4 major candidates. You've got Wilson, the Democrat, you've got Teddy for the Progressive Party, William Howard Taft, the regular Republican, and Eugene V. Debs was running as a strong campaign as the socialist candidate. In the end, Wilson is able to win the presidency, because even though the Republican Party was the dominant majority party of the time, with the party split, it left Wilson able to gain the normal Democratic vote and defeat both Teddy and Taft.
Though Teddy lost the election of 1912, 152 would be the vehicle he used to spread his progressive values to the Deep South, creating a movement that still influences American politics today. Just over a year later, in 1913, the 152 was involved in an accident at Livingston, Kentucky, being turned on her side. The crew perished in the accident, but the 152 was given a second chance, being rebuilt in the railroad's South Louisville shops shortly thereafter. The 152 would continue passenger service on the L&N, serving all over the system until more powerful locomotives were purchased by the railroad in the 1920s. The Pacific-class locomotives were then assigned to the Gulf Coast, a geographically flatter area. In 1934, the K2A Pacific would again be called to pull another famous passenger train. This time, the 152 would be pulling the Al Capone Special, conveying the famous gangster and 43 other prisoners in modified passenger cars, retrofitted with steel bars between Atlanta, Georgia and Mobile, Alabama for further transportation to Alcatraz. Capone, with an extensive criminal history during the Prohibition era, was convicted of tax evasion just 3 years earlier. The locomotive would spend its time serving the railroad along the Gulf Coast throughout the 30s and 40s. By 1953, the locomotive was the last of its kind on the L&N. On February 17, 1953, the 152 was retired, with its fate hanging in uncertainty. During this time, it was stored at Mobile, Alabama.
We called on the president of the L&N, who was then a man named John Tilford, Mr. John Tilford. And he dated back, he was at that point almost ready to retire. He was in his late 60s or 70s. But he had had a steam background. He had not worked mechanically, but he came from an era of steam locomotives, passenger trains, and so forth. And so 152 was an engine that somehow he had an association with. And that, the 152 and several of these other K2 class light Pacifics, which were the L&N's first Pacifics, were still operating down on the south end of the system. The Pensacola area, handling trains through Pensacola over to Chattahoochee, that was called our Panhandle branch, and the Pensacola branch, and then even local trains on the main line from Mobile over to New Orleans. And so there were several of these engines that operated right up to the very end of steam, and the 152 was one of those locomotives.
In 1954, thanks to efforts of local L&N rail fans, the number 152 was sent to the Kentucky Railway Museum, then located in Louisville, Kentucky. It was one of the museum's first pieces. For 30 years, it remained inoperative until a small group of volunteers assembled for the first restoration.
The locomotive had been stored outside since 1957, and the weather had completely deteriorated the jacket to the extent that when we took it off, it wasn't even usable for patterns, and the water that had run down behind the jacket and wet the asbestos had rusted out so many staybolt sleeves that it required almost a complete replacement of all flexible staybolts.
Down the road from the museum, about 300 or 400 feet, was a state garage. On Saturdays, the state didn't work. Steve would run down far up on the backhoes and bring it up to the museum, and we used it to lift stuff with. People volunteered money, and we had a lot of help from businesses around Louisville. A lot of them, okay, just forget it, that type of thing. Of course, they knew what we were doing. And I remember the guys that did the work on the air pump, we get it cleaned up, and he just volunteered. Okay, here, do it. And Paget, the crane company over in New Albany, they donated their time to lift it, put it back on its wheels and lift it off its wheels. They donated that time, and that's a lot of money, but no charge. You can't thank people like that enough, you know.
The overall lines of the engine remain the same as we wanted them to. The typical high stack of an engine of this era. The thing that makes it a modern engine are some of the appliances that we added for safety as well as other considerations. The cross-compound air compressor is a much higher capacity than the original air compressors on the engine. The power reverse was definitely a safety feature which we added. The low water alarm was a safety feature. We're real happy with it. We have the classic lines of the engine, but yet we have a modern performing engine.
Well, 152 is a nice little lady. And the first time I ran it was at a place called Chevrolet, Kentucky. A little sign on the track said Chevrolet. And Carl had to take a bathroom run. So I got in it. That's the first time I'd run it. And we're going along about 40, 45 miles an hour, and I climbed over the seat and took it till he got done.
After 13 years of work in 1985, the locomotive was again alive under her own steam power. Thanks to the dedicated steam team of the 1980s, number 152 would operate extensively on excursion trips over TTI, CSX, and Norfolk Southern. Later, the engine was used on the museum's Lebanon branch out of New Haven, which was one of the original routes the locomotive was assigned for when delivered to the L&N in 1905. Locomotive 152 has the distinction of being the official state locomotive of Kentucky and is also part of the National Register of Historic Places and Things. From 1985 to 2011, the locomotive was operated in regular excursion service but has since been waiting a second restoration at the Kentucky Railway Museum.
In the fall of 2011, the operation of the locomotive stopped. There were some issues that were repairable, but it was going to hit the 15-year requirement, the 1472, in the spring of the next year. So the steam crew wisely decided it was not worth doing all the work that would be necessary to restore it, just to run it a couple of more times.
You know, putting a steam locomotive on display is like propping up a corpse. You know, these are living, breathing animals. When you get them running, they're very, very vibrant, very lively, and just elicit a response that I just think they come as close to a living being than a mechanical object can. Right now, we're really going through our mechanical and boiler inspections, running gear and boiler inspections, and that's kind of in process. We've been doing disassembly. Basically, we disassembled the engine as far as we can go. At this point, it's going to be reassembly. Some of that work is going to be heavy, specialized work that will require certified contractors to do. The Coalition for Sustainable Rail is our engineering contractor. There's still some questions that they have regarding some of the construction and geometry, stay bolt spacing, that kind of thing. They're having to do a little bit more work and come back and do some more detailed analysis on some particular areas of construction in the boiler. But as we go forward, you know, there's going to be lots of opportunities for just basic grunt work, you know, people cleaning, painting, parts, that kind of thing. Of course, once we get all the main boiler work and mechanical work done, you know, there's a million pieces, and brakes and piping and injector systems and all that we'll have to go back piece by piece.
You know, why 152? Well, it is a historic piece. It's one of the oldest Pacific type locomotives, 462s, that's in existence in good shape and restorable. The potential exists there to restore operation. It's one of only 3 L&N locomotives that are still in existence. The other 2 are fine locomotives for display, but realistically, they're really not a type of locomotive that you could use in any type of excursion service. Even the shortest of runs would be uneconomical and not all that appealing. So 152 is a good candidate for restoration. It's sort of a sweet spot, particularly for Kentucky Railway Museum. in that it's not too small. On the other hand, it's not so large that is very expensive to maintain, like one of the other pieces we have at the museum, 2716. And it is the official locomotive of the state of Kentucky. So not only maintaining it for display, but it does seem logical and appropriate to restore it to operation.
Help bring 152 back to steam. Consider donating or volunteering at the Kentucky Railway Museum in New Haven. For more information on this incredible locomotive, visit kyrail.org.